Hello, good afternoon, all. Today, on behalf of the Student Opinion Society, under our Indian Governance Summit 2020, we have with us Mr. Harsh V. Pant. Student Opinion Society is a students' club based out of IIT Kanpur, which is also Institute's first student-run public policy think tank. We represent hundreds of students from campus who are interested in field of public policy and are interested to pursue their career in policy making and governance. We explore current stories in international news, economics, finance, and geopolitics by examining the facts and providing historical context. We cover a range of political, philosophical, economic, and historical topics. Indian Governance Summit is our latest initiative to take a deep dive into the world of public policy. Mr. Harsh V. Pant is a professor of international relations at King's College London. Professor Pant is also a fellow of Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies at Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is also Director of Studies and Strategic Studies at Observer Research Foundation. Professor Pant has recently been appointed as Honorary Director of Delhi School of Transnational Affairs. Professor Pant is also an active contributor on topics of international diplomacy and foreign policy at major Indian news houses like The Hindu, Times of India, Hindustan Times, and Live Mint. Professor Pant will discuss with us how India's foreign policy has emerged over years and the road that lies ahead after the pandemic. Over to you, Professor Pant.
Thank you, Pranab, and let me start by thanking the organizers, the Students' Opinion Society, IIT Kanpur, for having me here. It's wonderful to be able to talk to some of the brightest kids in Indian higher education, and it's wonderful to see their interest in public policy. I think that is one thing that we have often experienced that. Indian public policy discourse remains uneven at best, and at times some of our best and the brightest in IITs and IIMs in particular don't engage as deeply as with public policy issues as perhaps they should, because it's after all their country and their public policy is at stake. So I think it's wonderful that you are discussing the range of topics that you are doing at this summit. There are issues on parliament, democracy. There is a discussion on economy, and I'll do my bit to talk about in foreign policy. Now, foreign policy, there are two aspects of foreign policy. One is to understand Indian foreign policy. So, what is happening, the certain trend lines that we are witnessing at the moment. But what is equally interesting, perhaps, as students of public policy, as some of you who might end up becoming joining public policy mainstream, is what is happening to the world. Because Indian foreign policy will respond or is responding to what is happening in the larger international environment. It is not. It is not happening in a vacuum, or it will not happen in a vacuum. It is responding to some of the larger global trends, and those global trends in some ways will impact you, whether or not you are interested in public policy or not. You may not be interested in global affairs, but global affairs are interested in you. They will have an impact on your career, even if you decide to take a career purely out of your technological mainstream that you are presently engaged in. So clearly, I think the issues that surround us today, and this is not simply because of COVID-19, but I think the issues today are so dramatically different and so dramatically evolved in the last few months, I would say, that even last year, sitting in, say, September 2019, one would not have contemplated that we would be coming to terms with a world that would look so very different in a matter of months. So there are certain issues that I would like to bring to the table, and then also talk about some of the foreign policy trends, and then perhaps make it more interactive, take your questions, comments, and observations. Now, just very briefly on foreign policy. It is often said that foreign policies of major countries do not change dramatically over time. After all, they are a function of more fundamental features of a nation, like history or culture or geography. Uh, and therefore, it's very difficult to map out a terrain that might look dramatically different from, say, one government to another, one prime minister to another, one leader to another, etc. So what is important is that foreign policies evolve on a continuous basis. If they are not evolving, then I think either the nation itself is not evolving, or the nation has no ambitions. And if there is one thing that you know about today's India, is that it's extremely ambitious. The youth in particular are extremely ambitious. They are aspirational. They want to see their country, uh, their nation, perhaps in areas where even my generation, which is not very old, but a generation younger, older to you, perhaps, did not envision. We were still living under the constraints of Cold War, post-Cold War environment, a leadership that was still looking back as much as it was looking forward. But suddenly, you have a generation that is responding, or that is unshackled almost by the constraints of the past, and that liberates a nation, that liberates a civilization, that liberates policymakers from a lot of unnecessary constraints that come with it, that come with that backward looking postures. So I think we are also in an environment where a lot is changing, a lot is evolving, and Indian foreign policy has to evolve repeatedly, continuously, and in ways that perhaps your parents or even my parents did not envision. But if you look at today's environment, there is COVID-19, there is pressure of a health pandemic, which is gradually and very, I would not say gradually anymore, it is rapidly transforming into an economic crisis. Look at the state of economies around the world today. It's quite distressing to see how major economies are where they are positioned today. Indian economy, of course, is facing its own negative headwinds. But there is also a challenge of this health and wealth crisis. There is also a geopolitical crisis, which I'm sure you are aware of, that we are facing a crisis on our borders. And this crisis is not the perennial crisis that we have faced on the LOC. This is a crisis on LAC, line of actual control with China, a much bigger power, a much more robust entity in international affairs, and a power that wants to shape global affairs in ways that are unprecedented in recent memory. So you are looking at a geopolitical shift, a geopolitical environment where China is every day in the news. Um, it can be because of India, because of what is happening on the borders with India. It can be because of what China is doing to Taiwan, for example. Last 2 days, it had been sending its fighter jets over to Taiwan, sending a message to Taiwan, be under control, or what it is doing to Hong Kong, what it is doing what it is doing in East South China Sea and East China Sea, what it is doing to Europe with its disinformation campaign, and of course you would have read the recent reports about how extensive the scale and scope of snooping that Chinese agencies, Chinese actors, Chinese industrial houses are doing across the board, across the world. So what we are looking at today is a rather shifty international environment, an environment that is often, for analysts, for observers, for students like myself, it's very difficult to conceptualize because it's changing so very rapidly. Some of the assumptions with which we have grown over the last 2 decades are falling apart in front of our eyes. So therefore it's a question. It's not simply a question of COVID-19. It's not simply a question of of an economic crisis. It's not simply a question of China. It is also fundamentally a question of globalization. When I started reading newspapers, uh, the one thing that that used to come out from the news was the world was changing towards or moving towards globalization. The time of 1990s, 2000s, where the world was coming to terms with, where from the Cold War era to post Cold War era, then that post Cold War era was being defined in terms of uh, extreme degree of economic networking, extreme degree of economic interaction, which was beginning to shape in front of our eyes. Today, something equally dramatic is happening. Uh, Deglobalization is happening in front of our eyes. Countries are looking inwards. Countries are becoming protectionist. Countries are becoming Indian Prime Minister says that the biggest lesson from COVID-19 is that India should be self-reliant. Of course, there is a difference between self-reliance and autarky, but clearly, from America first in America to India's concept of self-reliance, something is happening that is different from just 5 years back. The push towards greater economic globalization. Countries are stopping in their tracks. They are reevaluating their options. They are looking at global supply chains. They are looking at technology evolution. They are looking at how to interact with, how to engage with China, how to reduce dependencies on China. And remember, China in some ways over the past few years has emerged as an anchor of global economics, of global trade, global commerce, global technological evolution. So in that sense, this is going to be a world that is going to be very, very different, or this is likely to be very different from the ones that we have grown accustomed to. And this has an impact not simply on bigger issues, which I'll discuss in terms of foreign policy. It will have an impact on relatively more, which we would call mundane matters, like what kind of jobs come to India, what kind of jobs get out of India, how will your job market shape up, how will you look at the interaction with certain kinds of countries, how will you look at manufacturing base in this country, whether we can sustain a manufacturing base in this country given where we are coming from. So a lot of these questions, which might look divorced from foreign policy, today have become central to our conceptualization of where the world is going and how we should react and contemplate our interactions with it. So if you're looking at it from Indian foreign policy perspective, what are the drivers that are shaping Indian foreign policy? Some of them I've just briefly mentioned, but I'll just conceptualize them. One is the structural driver. What is happening to the international environment? What is happening to the structural environment around us? So it's very interesting. From the early 1990s, which used to be the unipolar moment that America is supreme after the demise of the Soviet Union, to a world where multipolarity was seen as a norm, to a world today where increasingly there is no real answer. On the one hand, there are people who would tell you that it's going to be a China-US competition, China-US bipolar world that is going to shape the global environment. But on the other, there are equally important other power centers around the world, be it India, be it European Union, be it Russia, be it Brazil, for example, which are redefining, which are reshaping their foreign policy priorities in ways that perhaps does not conform to this idea of a world being either bipolar or a unipolar, but more in the realm of multipolarity. So one element of the structural dynamic is that what kind of a world order are we looking at? India is going to be a very, very important part of that, despite recent economic collapse, despite recent challenges that India is facing and will face over the next 2 to 3 years. But there is no question that eventually India will be either second or third largest global economy in the world, whichever measure you use. And that will have an impact. That will have an impact on Indian foreign policy priorities, Indian ambitions, Indian aspirations. There is also the other end of this structural dynamic, which I just touched upon, is globalization. How you look at globalization. Globalization is a structural imperative. It's something that that countries took for granted, that countries like India and China benefited enormously from. You look at it today, the concept of deglobalization, the idea that America and China, America in particular, wants to decouple from China. You also look at India. The debate in India today is we are not using the word decoupling, but we are trying to make our intentions very clear that we want to reduce dependencies on China, be it on trade and commerce, be it on strategic sectors, be it not allowing Chinese entities to participate in Indian government contracts. So we are walling off Indian certain sectors from Chinese involvement, and this will have a cost. And this is already there are already costs involved. For example, our startup sector, which relies on Chinese money, there is a lot of Chinese investment that is already feeling the pressures of this policy, pressures of India trying to move away from the Chinese orbit. And so you are looking at a world that is structurally changing very, very rapidly, be it in terms of the political dimension, geopolitical dimension of where the world is moving, how the world is evolving in terms of power centers, or be it in terms of just geopolitics. Finally, this aspect of One idea that we have always grown up with, that global power actually resides in the Euro-Atlantic domain. That it is America plus Western Europe that actually were the wealthiest, the most developed, the most powerful countries in the world, where the center of gravity of global politics have always lied. So if you go back, just first World War, Second World War, both of these world wars emerged out of the European contestation, and major powers contesting who will control Western Europe. Even Cold War, to an extent, was largely an extension of that argument. Soviet Union wanted to push towards Western Europe. America and Western Alliance wanted to keep Soviet Union towards the east by bringing up that entire firewall between Eastern and Western Europe. But today, what is happening? Today, structurally, we are looking at the world where some of the most dynamic, some of the most powerful, some of the most economically interesting and innovative powers are in Indo-Pacific. So the rise of the Indo-Pacific is the new narrative. And Indo-Pacific, again, is a new concept, a new structural reality where we combine Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. We are not looking at these oceans as two distinct entities. We are combining them together and looking at the larger landscape of this geography, which is now the predominant factor in how we evaluate global environment. So in a sense, the structural reality of the world is that we have moved away from the Euro-Atlantic moment and we have now entered the Indo-Pacific moment. And this is already having some very strong consequences for global power, global politics, Indian foreign policy. I'll come to those consequences in a bit, but first I'm just laying out some of these basic drivers. So one driver is the structural driver for Indian foreign policy, Indian foreign policy is responding to these drivers, to which I'll come back in a bit. But what are the other drivers? The second very important driver, and which I think often people underestimate, which we don't talk about when we talk about, when we are talking about issues about global politics, global strategy, foreign policy. Foreign policy essentially of every country, and this can be true of America, this can be true of China, this is equally true of India. Foreign policy for policy makers, because they are essentially political decisions, is an extension of domestic politics. It reflects your domestic priorities. It reflects your domestic interests. It reflects the kind of power shifts that you witness domestically. So the second most important factor here is what has happened to India domestically in the last few years. And what has happened? The major shift, a major factor in India has been that Indian politics has moved to center-right. Indian politics has moved from the control of Congress and its allies towards BJP and a BJP-centric political entity. So we are now looking at this dramatic shift in India. You may not like it, some may like it, some favor it, some have reservations about it, but this is the reality. And that reality means that BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, its ideology, its view of the world, how it views certain relationships, who it prioritizes, who it does not, will have a bearing on how Indian foreign policy is projected, Indian foreign policy's priorities are projected on the global stage. You will find that difference in articulation. You will find differences in emphases. Even people who say that foreign policies don't change have to recognize the fact that they evolve. And if Indian domestic politics has moved dramatically, and it has moved dramatically to successive elections where Prime Minister Modi is getting the kind of seats that he's getting, reflect a certain shift in the mindset of India, Indian middle classes, Indian policymakers, Indian intelligentsia, and most importantly, Indian youth. India is a very young country. So that demography it will have an impact on that priorities. And so the ability how foreign policy is articulated will reflect this shift. And I'll come to that, in a bit, what is how that shift is reflected. But I just want you to ponder over this fact that Indian foreign policy is a reflection of what happens domestically. You are looking at a dramatic shift. And this is something that is happening in India after almost 7 decades of independence, 6.5. That this is going to have a very, very important impact on how this is reflected. And remember, what it means is not simply that BJP is winning. It also means that the center of gravity of Indian politics shifting to the right means that other parties are also shifting to the right. When you have Mr. Rahul Gandhi trying to proclaim that he is a Hindu leader by showing his Janeu, what is he doing? He's responding to that environment where he has to underline his credentials as a religious Hindu. So this means that domestic politics has shifted to the right, where the other political parties who are doing their politics from the left are also veering towards the right. There will be a difference in connotation whether BJP has moved further to the right and how far these parties are. But there is no question that they are responding to this larger climate of what is happening in India, how the Indian mood is shifting, how do you respond to that mood, and by doing that, your articulation, the way you represent your own constituency, the way you represent their mood will change. And so you see this shift. So you see this shift in various spheres, and I'll just talk about some two major episodes in the last 2 years. One is Article 370, and the other is Ram Janmabhoomi inauguration, Ram Temple inauguration. Look at the responses of major political parties. They would have decried it, saying that Article 370 is being revoked. But no political party today will give you assurance that when they will be in power tomorrow, they will bring it back. Similarly, on the temple inauguration, every political party was trying to claim credit. Every political party was wishing well, and that how let's all build a grand temple there. So in a sense, this is reflective of a larger mood change in the country, and which is being reflected through the political parties. That political parties, irrespective of where they were before 2014, post 2014, they are having to do their politics because the center of more towards the right, because the center of gravity has moved towards the right. And this is a reality that will be reflected in foreign policy. The other element here in domestic politics is that, as was what I mentioned, was how do you respond to certain demographic, and India's most important demographic is the youth. So this is the youth that is highly aspirational, highly motivated, highly nationalistic. So in that sense, nationalism becomes ingrained in how you respond to that challenge. Now, even if, so let's assume, for example, what is happening on the border with China. Even if Mr. Modi and his government would have wanted a settlement, it's very difficult to do it because the country, especially the youth of this country, would not tolerate a situation where India is either begging to the Chinese, or India is appeasing the Chinese, or India is telling them that allowing them to take away territory from India. So you have a distinct way for various reasons in which this will be reflected in how foreign policy is conducted. So highly ambitious, highly aspirational, highly nationalistic mood of this population will be reflected in how political parties, how governments respond to this foreign policy challenges. Then you have final driver is of course the kind of political leadership you have, and that I had mentioned at the very beginning also, that there is a shift in the kind of political leadership we are witnessing. So if you think about it, it is not simply the BJP, it is also other political parties where a younger leadership has taken over. Even the dynastic political parties are being forced to reckon with this change. So you can take any dynastic political party like Samajwadi Party, for example. The reason why Akhilesh Yadav had to respond and come up and make a move away from his father's shadow was because it was very clear that the older paradigm was not working, that the youth of India was not responding to a political party that was still stuck in the past with Mr. Mulayam Singh Yadav as its face. So in that sense, a new leadership is emerging in India across the board, and it is also emerging in politics. Now, Mr. Modi is the first prime minister in India who is born after independence. So that will have that will reflect on his sensibilities, that will reflect on what he feels is important, what is not. So therefore, there is an underlying thrust in what kind of shift we are witnessing, and how that shift will be articulated to India and to the world. Now, these are the structural, domestic, political, as well as individual level factors that will have an impact. And they are leading to Indian foreign policy, which is manifesting itself in various ways. I'll mention a few and then I'll open this up for discussion. One very important manifestation is that we have moved beyond non-alignment. Non-alignment used to be this meta framework that used to define Indian foreign policy. If you take a textbook of Indian foreign policy, it will always tell you how the Indian foreign policy can be studied by looking at this idea of non-alignment. But if you look at, for the last six years, no one in the government has even mentioned non-alignment. Again, one of the reasons being that BJP does not owe anything to its ideological commitment to non-alignment. They don't have an ideological commitment to non-alignment. It was Congress's commitment to non-alignment as an idea because of its historical legacy. So, in a sense, BJP and this government, Modi government, has nothing to do with non-alignment. Mr. Modi himself has not attended any of the non-aligned summits, the two that has happened under his watch, and the articulation has been, and very very interestingly, which I think is worth observing. The articulation is that we have moved away from non-alignment to issue-based alignments. We have moved away from this rigidity that we don't want partnerships to one where we want partnerships, we want strong partnerships, we want partnerships on issues because those partnerships enhance India's strategic autonomy. Unlike in the past where the argument was, okay, let's not go very close to the Americans because that will make us stooges of the Americans. Now the argument is we have to develop relationships with countries like America, and with other countries, because it's only by having these partnerships do we get some strategic autonomy, especially when it comes to China. So you are developing these partnerships, and partnerships are bilateral partnerships, trilateral partnerships, even quadrilateral partnerships like the Quad, US, Japan, Australia, and India in the Indo-Pacific. So in a sense, issue-based alignments have become the new normal for Indian foreign policy. And this is being reflected not simply in the maritime space. Sometimes it's very confusing for outsiders. When you look at India, being part of Indo-Pacific, where India is engaged with America, Japan, Australia, etc. At the same time, you are also engaged with countries like Russia and China and Iran, and when it comes to Eurasia, when it comes to Afghanistan, and when it comes to Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But this is the reality of our times. That India is not simply a maritime power, India is also a continental power. So India has to have equities in the system where India can respond to that challenge by having partnerships with countries like Russia, for example, like Iran, for example, because India has an interest in what Iran does or does not do in Afghanistan. India wants an alternative route to Afghanistan via Iran, via Chabahar. That's why India is developing Chabahar port in Iran, despite American sanctions. So we are looking at a world which is where India is trying to position itself relatively differently from the past, where alignments, partnerships are not seen as a problem, and where enhancing the strategic autonomy becomes the most fundamental factor. And this brings me to the China question. Because the second most important element here is, and I would say the first most important element here is, in Indian foreign policy today, is China. You take one issue in Indian foreign policy and Indian national security, which is not in one way or another dovetail with the China question. There is none. There is no question today in Indian foreign and national security policies that does not involve the China factor. And that means that China will have to be dealt with by India in ways that again are unprecedented. One of the things that we can of course do is to build our muscle, build our military. So what do you do in the short term? In the short term, your only chance of managing the question of China is to have engagements with countries which are like-minded. So like-minded countries become your partners. And what has happened since the advent of COVID-19 is that the world has looked at China question very, very differently. Not only the fact that China has become very aggressive, as we were discussing at the very beginning, from Southeast Asia to Indian borders, to Taiwan, to Hong Kong, everywhere China has become very aggressive, but also because of the way China tried to influence international institutions like WHO in dealing with COVID-19 crisis. That lack of transparency in the Chinese in the Chinese manner of managing COVID-19 has led to an enormous resentment around the world, and a pushback is emerging. So the China question therefore dovetails with Indian foreign policy question, and India can therefore have partnerships with countries from Australia, Japan, ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, to countries in its neighborhood, to Western Europe and America, which are also facing the onslaught of China. So the China question therefore dovetails with India in that sense, and India, because China is such an important actor in India's own aspiration to rise on the global stage, a constraining option, this allows India to manage China's rise. Then you have the question of, as I've said, partnerships across the board, whether it's with Quad, whether it's with ASEAN, etc. Then you have, you come closer to the neighborhood, and this question has often been talked about, that why is the neighborhood such a big problem for India? Because if you look around the neighborhood, there are various problems. Whether in particular, of course, with Pakistan, there is a perennial problem, but also with countries like Nepal in recent months that we have witnessed Nepalese policymakers trying to manage the border question in a way that is not in sync with their bilateral ties. So there has been there has been this positioning of India as a problem, where because China question has emerged in the neighborhood as equally important. Our smaller neighbors can now pit India against China and get better deals from both, or at least try to get better deals from both. If Indian aid does not really match the terms and conditions they want, they can bring in China, which is very happy to give them lots of money, of course, at a long-term cost, which we have seen in the case of Sri Lanka, for example, the debt trap diplomacy. We have seen in other countries, but in the short term, it does give the smaller countries in India's neighborhood that space to maneuver with India. So for India, that neighborhood has been an issue. And what has India tried to do in recent years? In recent years, what has happened is that India's move away from SAARC to BIMSTEC. I don't know how many of you would know BIMSTEC, but BIMSTEC is a Bay of Bengal community of countries for cooperation on sectoral topics, multi-sectoral technical and economic cooperation. Now, the idea there is that if Pakistan does not want regional cooperation to happen, then let's ignore Pakistan and let's take our regional cooperation endeavors towards the Bay of Bengal. So from west to east, shift the focus to east, which will do two things. One, it allows India to frame its neighborhood differently. When you say Bay of Bengal, you also bring in countries like Myanmar and Thailand into India's neighborhood frame. And these countries are culturally India's neighbors. The cultural influence that India has in Myanmar and Thailand is far significant than we have acknowledged so far. And it also allows India to seamlessly move into Southeast Asia. So Thailand and ASEAN, which are members, and Myanmar, which are members of ASEAN, allow India to penetrate Southeast Asia. So in that sense, the idea is India is not simply a South Asian country defined by traditional confines of South Asia, but it's also a country that has a much bigger footprint beyond just these immediate peripheries of South Asia. And that final two things. One, what has happened in recent years is that India has also become more confident in melding together various instrumentalities of state power. So soft power and hard power. Now, soft power, on the one hand, you have Indian government trying to proclaim a lot about yoga and Yoga Day, International Yoga Day. There is a lot of emphasis on cultural affinities. There is a lot of emphasis on how India can engage with various countries on basis of culture, and how India has been the source of that cultural influence. But on the other hand, India has also not been shy of using military instruments as part of its diplomatic engagement. You see that now very, very clearly in what is happening in China today. Negotiations are going on, but at the same time, Indian defense forces have not been shy of occupying certain dominating strategic heights that have given India some much needed diplomatic leverage on the negotiating table. Similarly, when you look at India's response in Uri, in Balakot, both of them were response to Pakistan aggression or Pakistan's use of terrorism against India. The idea is that India would not be shy of using military as an instrument of state policy where its interests are hurt, where it wants to send out a message to its adversaries. So, in that sense, that melding of hard and soft power is a very important development. And finally, restructuring of India's domestic institutions. Now, one of the problems that India has often faced is the capacity problem. That many people have argued that India's foreign policy, for example, is way too small compared to its ambitions. Indian foreign policy architecture is not suited for India's ambitions. Indian foreign service is very small, and so on and so forth. And what has been done now is to gradually, of course, increase the numbers of foreign service officers intake, but also to restructure the domestic institutional architecture. So you now have a newly defined way, a new version of Indian MEA, where there is now thematic architecture of various groups. For example, there is a center. There's the Indo-Pacific wing, which was not there in the past. Given the requirements of our times, that is much needed. Similarly, there is a wing on new and emerging strategic technologies. So there is an evolution in the way Indian Foreign Service, Indian Ministry of External Affairs, is thinking about its resources and how to use those resources. Similarly, on the national security front, we have seen a number of changes, the biggest one being the appointment of the Chief of Defence Staff, a demand that has been long in the making, that it was there for a very long time and now has been fructified. So clearly, India is responding to the challenge that it is facing around its periphery, from China, from the larger forces of globalization, from the larger forces of international power structure, and is trying to respond to it both in terms of having policy positions, in terms of having institutional architectures, and also in terms of its ideational shift, which is represented from moving away from non-alignment to issue-based alignments. So I will just end there, and I hope that we can have some back and forth in terms of questions, comments, and observations from you. Pranab, thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a really insightful piece of knowledge that you shared with us. We have a few questions from our audience. The first one uh, is, what will be Indian foreign policy if Joe Biden wins?
Okay, so should I take them one by one?
Uh, so the rest of the questions that we have, it is not something which is related to India's foreign policy with US.
Okay. Yeah, that's, I think, this is a major policy question of the day because the elections are in November. And I would just also take this opportunity to say briefly about Indo-US relations, because what we have seen, I would say, since the last years of Clinton administration, is that Indo-US relations have progressed pretty well, and the trajectory has been quite robust. Now, there are a number of reasons for it, and I think the most important being that there is a strategic convergence between US and India about what kind of a global balance of power both of them are comfortable with, and therefore it has allowed them to work together on a number of areas. And that has forced America in particular to shed some of its initial reluctance to confront some of those issues that have long been bedeviling this relationship, the nuclear question being the foremost. So if you see from Clinton administration, it was a democratic administration, George W. Bush administration, a Republican administration, Obama, again a Democratic one, and Trump, a Republican, although again a very unique kind of a Republican administration. And now Joe Biden, if he comes to power, he will be a Democrat. So if let's forget Joe Biden for a minute, but if you look at Clinton, Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, you see a trend, which is about strengthening the relationship, a trend which is about finding solutions to the problems that bedevil the relationship. So under George W. Bush, you had the civil nuclear deal with India, and which allowed the relationship to progress beyond the nuclear question. And remember, Obama came to office with a lot of concerns about India. Obama was not really a very great friend of India at the very beginning. He was talking about all sorts of issues like Kashmir and human rights, and the fact that he was not a very big supporter of the nuclear deal. But by the time he left, he had become one of the biggest friends of India. Self-proclaimed. He was saying that, "Oh, I'm a great friend of India." He came to India and not was a chief guest at the Republic Day celebrations, even addressed the Indian Parliament. So you have had a dramatic recovery. Similarly, under Trump, when Trump was getting elected, he was bracketing India along with China as these two powers that have taken a lot from America, that are that have colluded, that have made the international economic environment to their benefit. But when he in power, look at where the relations with China have gone, and look at how we have been able to manage Mr. Trump. Even Indo-US relations under Trump, I would say, are perhaps at their best, because Trump was equally strong on Pakistan, which Obama was not. So this was another one of India's problems, that Pakistan was not being made accountable for its terrorism. Instead, America keeps funneling it money. Trump stopped the flow of money to Pakistan, and again, by becoming tough on China, he also gave India some breathing space. So in fact, in more ways than one, India and the US today are on the same page. And of course, India reciprocated by signing a number of the foundational agreements that have been on board, whether it's a logistic agreement, whether it's a COMCASA, which is a communications exchange agreement, etc. So you have a situation where Indo-US relations today are on an even keel, despite the challenge that Trump poses and despite our differences. Trump has imposed sanctions on Iran, but India managed to keep Chabahar project out of the sanctions. Trump has imposed, the American Congress has imposed sanctions on countries that are doing business with Russia on defense. So S-400 deal with Russia, missile defense deal with Russia. Turkey has been sanctioned. India has not been sanctioned. So there is a sense in America that India is a partner that is worth investing in, and whoever comes to office post November, that sense is not going to go away. Mr. Biden, given his past experience under Obama administration, is likely to continue along the same trajectory. I don't see a major disruption happening. There might be some issues where he might change focus, he might articulate it differently, but I don't see a major challenge there, because both India and America fundamentally converge on big questions of the day. And the biggest question of the day is how to manage China, but also what kind of a balance of power the two look for in the Indo-Pacific. And there the convergence is so strong that other factors become relatively less important.
So, moving on to the next question. So the question is around Quad. Uh, how does Quad group openly criticizing China affects the trade relations that India has with China? Since India does not share a long-term trade relation with neither with Japan nor with Australia, as it does with China. Uh, in this scenario, won't it be uh, more justified to first establish a trade relation with Japan and Australia even before criticizing and banning Chinese trade?
See, Quad's existence in more ways than one is a tribute to how China's aggressive actions have made it virtually impossible for countries in the region to look at their relations with China through a bilateral prism. And this applies equally to Australia, Japan, as it does to India. If you see, there was at one point Australia was seen as the weakest link in the Quad because of Australia's over dependence on China for trade. But the relations have soured. Australia-China relations have gone downhill so dramatically in the last, I would say, 3 years, that Australia is now willing to shape and to articulate a very robust response to China's rise. So, in that sense, you know, Quad becomes an instrument of managing China without actually saying that, look, we want to target China at all. I mean, a lot of the things that Quad has said since 2014, since it was resurrected, is not really about hard power stuff. They are mostly talking about infrastructure development. They are mostly talking about softer issues. How do you generate confidence in other countries in the region, and that they have alternatives to China? Because a large part of the problem in Indo-Pacific is that China's dominance is so huge, it's so powerful, that other smaller countries find that they have no other option but to go to China, be it economics, trade, whether it's strategic and security. And so by articulating that response, Quad is saying that there is an option, that you don't just have to say that China is there, therefore we will go with China. So you see that being articulated by Quad. Now gradually I think it will take on a more hard power stuff also. There will be more exercises. There is talk of Australia being invited to the Malabar exercises, where India, Japan and America exercise, and Australia has been kept apart. Now Australia is going to be invited. So there is going to be greater coordination, greater interoperability between the defense forces of these four countries as well going forward. So the sense there is that yes, it is going to be very important for these four countries to develop economic synergies, but these countries are arguing, or perhaps are finding, that they cannot wait till that happens. They have to start building on a regional security architecture, because the security situation is going down the hill. It's not that Japan and China are not trading with each other, or it's not that Australia and China are not trading with each other. They are. In fact, even India is not saying that we will cut off all economic ties with China. What India is saying, that India is going to be more sectoral in its approach. There are going to be certain sectors where Chinese involvement is not going to be allowed. There are going to be certain sectors where China would be walled off. There are going to be certain technologies which India is going to develop on its own, or with the help of like-minded countries, not with the help of China. That is what India is saying. I don't think India has articulated a position which is a blanket ban on Chinese products, which is a blanket ban on trade with China. That's not possible, that's not feasible, and that's not also very likely. But what these countries are saying is that you cannot, in a world that is being reshaped by China's use of trade for geopolitical purposes, you cannot look at trade and strategic factors as two distinct domains. China has used economics, commerce, trade, and technology for geopolitical purposes, and therefore for other countries it is equally important to respond. It doesn't make sense to have these baskets of cases, because you gain leverage, and China has shown that you gain leverage in one while investing in the other.
So, also another question from our audience is that you had mentioned in your book that India has missed the opportunity in Afghanistan. Do you think India's current trajectory of cautiously recognizing Taliban while continuously working with Afghanistan government will work in the long term?
Well, you know, when you say Afghanistan government, it's very likely that Taliban will become part of that government very soon. that there is going to be a power sharing agreement where Taliban is going to be at the power center. So whether or not India likes, India has to respond to that reality. So what I think India has said, that India wants an Afghan-led and Afghan-owned peace process. Whatever the requirements of that of the Afghan government, India is willing to fulfill that. If that Afghan government wants a peace process to continue, India would support it. Now, so far, the Afghan government, the term is used for the Ghani government. But that government is moving towards a position where, after some negotiations, it's very likely, and it's almost done, a deal that Taliban or sections of the Taliban will be part of a power sharing agreement. So the government definition would change. Afghan government would become a government in which Taliban will have some power, if not a large share of the power. So India will have to respond to that. India will have to engage with that government. Uh, Taliban are not India's best friends, but I think black and white options are not available in diplomacy. You have to deal with whoever is in power. India is, we have dealt with much worse entities or equally worse entities in other parts of the world. So I don't think that would be a major constraint. I think the issue is whether Taliban in government or outside government are willing to recognize the challenge that India would face, or recognize the interests of India. That is the biggest problem. Whether they are going to work at the behest of the Pakistanis, or whether they are going to work for taking into account Indian interests. And I think that is where India has to draw those red lines. That is where India has to make it very clear that unless those red lines are adhered to, India also has some leverage. Now, one argument is that India, does not really have much leverage. I myself, in my older book, which I wrote I think a few years back, I wrote that India from the very beginning, by adopting a hyper cautious approach in Afghanistan, which meant that the argument became that India will always be this aid provider. We will provide a lot of aid, we will provide a lot of development aid to government capacity building, we will do this, but we will not put boots on the ground. Because, and that is not, see, boots on the ground, that was based on this assumption, which is a fair assumption in democracy, that there is no political consensus for it. Now, that argument is not based on any strategic logic. It is based on this argument that there is no domestic political consensus on it. Now, my argument then was that if you want to invest so much in a country which is a hard power country, where people are willing to die to protect their interests, and you say that we are going to fund a lot, we are going to put a lot of economic resources, but we are not going to let our soldiers die there, or we are not going to put our troops on the ground to protect those interests, that the signal it gives to your adversaries is that you are not serious about protecting those interests. So why would they take you seriously? That was an argument I had made, and I think, in a sense, India lost some credibility down the years because of this factor, that Pakistanis, whether you like them or not, were actually willing, to be there and to die. They were sending people. It may not be a very far-sighted policy, but what it gave Pakistanis at the end of the day is, since 2001 to 2020, today Pakistanis are sitting in the saddle. Their proteges, their proxies like Taliban are going to be part of the government structure, so they will have leverage there. So, in a sense, this hyper cautious approach did not pay India the kind of dividends that India expected. India is the largest aid giver, India is the largest aid provider, India is the most liked country in Afghanistan, and yet we have to fight it out to sit at these kind of negotiations, partly because we were overcautious. And now, of course, there is no other option. We have to engage with every stakeholder. We have to engage with the Taliban, which India has indicated that it is willing to do. And in the process, we will have to see what Taliban do and what kind of signals they send. So far, they have sent signals which are relatively optimistic. They are saying that when Article 370 happened, was revoked last year, and Pakistanis tried to make a link with Kashmir, Taliban spokesperson categorically came out and said it has nothing to do with Kashmir. It is an internal matter for India to decide. and we have nothing to do with it. So, and they have also sent signals that they are willing to engage with India and so on and so forth. So they are also signaling, and therefore it's not that India does not have any leverage. India retains its leverage. After all, if Afghanistan has to become or keep on, keep on the path of where it started from in 2001, then India is the most important neighbor. You can't ignore India. India is the largest growing economy in the neighborhood. So how can you ignore India? Pakistan is not going to sustain your interests. So India will have to be factored into. But what kind of a relationship that's going to be, what kind of an engagement that's going to be, that I think is still to be worked out.
So we are kind of coming to the end of this session. We would be taking the last question. Uh, so the participant asks, does India have a post-pandemic template for global leadership in the 21st century?
In the last, so can
In
you
the
repeat that?
21st century.
Well, I think leadership. What I found interesting is that if you go to the first few months of this pandemic, there was utter confusion around the world. China, of course, was seen as part of the problem, a country that, through a mission or commission, had not revealed the true extent of the problem in a timely manner, and therefore made it very difficult for the world to respond effectively. Had they done that, perhaps the crisis would not have burgeoned to the kind of proportions that it attained later on. On the other hand, you had a country like the US that that was completely seen as off the mark. That Trump administration could not get a handle on the situation. Trump administration could not make its health, could not generate enough resources for a health infrastructure for a developed economy. So the problems were quite huge. If you were looking around the world, Europe, for example, Western Europe was facing a lot of problems. There were divergences within Europe. You had countries like Italy and Spain that were facing the brunt, and you have countries like Germany and France that were trying to control resources. So a lot of confusion around the world in terms of leadership. And I thought India came off relatively well in that, because if you go back, you saw how the Modi government, Mr. Modi himself called on the SAARC conference, trying to engage the region, trying to work out a mechanism of helping other countries in the region. Also talking of how India will continue to supply medicines, the pharmaceuticals that were needed for this crisis to the world. And I think at some point India also was the first one to ask G20 for a meeting. So in a sense, the leadership that India showed was much of a much higher standards in some ways than perhaps was expected, because India itself was was dealing with a major problem. India was grappling with it. Other countries that should have been or that were seen as presumptive leaders actually came off very poorly. So in a sense, leadership model, the idea that India is now propagating and has been doing for some time now, is that India wants to be a leading player in the international system. It wants to shape the rules in the global order, not simply be a rule taker but a rule maker. And I think that's an important, again, difference from the past, when India was reluctant to be a global leader. The idea that you had a famous quote by Mrs. Gandhi saying that India doesn't do power politics, that we are not interested. So in a sense, there is a shift happening, and again, that shift is happening because of various factors that I talked about, but also a simple factor that the world is also expecting something of India. There is also an argument which is made that how can India be a global leader when India has so many problems domestically? We have bad infrastructure, bad roads, bad this, bad that, caste system, communal riots, etc. Now, my response to that is, which country in the world is perfect? You look at America, which everyone thinks is a global leader, is still facing racial conflict. You have China, which is full of domestic problems. So if you think that you can only become a global leader once you have resolved all your domestic problems, then I don't think any country will ever be a global leader, because global leadership comes because of the capacities that you engender and the expectations that the world has of you. So at the moment, I think there is a lot of expectation from India, from various quarters of the world, and there is also a change in the Indian policy-making mindset that India wants to play that game. India wants to be in that league, and which is in sync, I think, with the larger aspirational Indian that also wants his or her country to play in the big league. So I think if you bring it all together, you do see an India which perhaps will have a very very important, would like to play a leadership role in the world.
Thank you so much, sir. So, this brings us to the end of the session. On behalf of all the participants and attendees, I would like to thank you for enlightening us with all the latest developments and the crucial diplomacy which is undergoing in the sphere of foreign policy, and how India is actually positioned in the big leagues of geopolitics that is being played, not just as a order taker, but also as a rule maker. On behalf of Student Opinion Society, I would again like to thank you for interacting with the students, and thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Pranav. Thank you, everyone.